In the early 2010s, ground-penetrating radar systems, the United States' largest company specializing in the detection of underground utilities, was called to a residential property on Brownsville Road in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Their job was an odd one, to use their radar to scan the ground at the bottom of an old oak tree. There were no utilities to install, no construction work scheduled at the house. Their task was simply to scan and report their findings. And so they did, and were surprised to discover a man-made disturbance at the base of the tree. 11 by 6 foot, it seemed to contain 4 figures lying horizontally 4 to 5 feet below the earth. It was, in short, an excavated gravesite. When they shared their findings with the owner of the house, he was not surprised. After all, Bob Cranmer had long suspected there were human remains in his garden. Local legend, his own research, and over 2 decades of horrific happenings experienced by himself, his family, and the priests he invited into his home all told him there must have been. For certainly, what took place in the Cranmer family's home after they moved in December 1988 was anything but normal, and could only be attributed to something otherworldly. Restless spirits of the dead, whose lives had been terribly cut short, a decades-old curse whose malignant energy saturated the very fabric of the building, and even, quite possibly, a demonic entity whose grip became so strong on that old monstrous house that Cranmer on more than one occasion was left not merely fearing for his life, but his soul as well. My name is Laura, and you are watching The Paranormal Scholar. Before we discuss this case any further, if you could please allow a brief interlude for me to thank the sponsor of this video, Established Titles. Established Titles is a fun and novel way to enable you to call yourself Lord or Lady, all while preserving the natural woodlands of Scotland and helping global reforestation efforts. Based on a historic custom whereby Scottish landowners are referred to as lairds or lords and ladies, Established Titles title packs give you at least 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Eddleston, Scotland. Each title is formalised by an official certificate bearing a crest and unique plot number, which allows you to identify the exact location of your land, declaring you in perpetuity to be known by the style and title of Lord or Lady. These title packs mean you could officially change your name to Lord or Lady and thus restyle yourself as such on credit cards, plane tickets, and dinner reservations. Best of all, however, is Established Titles' commitment to the environment. A tree being planted with every order, Established Titles works with the global charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support global reforestation efforts. These delightfully eccentric souvenir title packs also make wonderful gifts, most especially at the last minute. And with their couples packs, you can even gift adjoining plots of land. Better yet, Established Titles has told me that the first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot. So, depending upon how many of you want to become a lord or a lady, we can build our own elegantly eccentric paranormal kingdom together in the midst of Scotland. At the moment, Established Titles is running a suitably grand holiday sale. Plus, if you use the code Paranormal Scholar, you will get an additional 10% off. Simply go to establishedtitles.com/paranormal scholar to get your gifts and help support conservation efforts in a unique and memorable way. Thank you. Now on with the video. Bob Cranmer was 32 years old when he moved into 3406 Brownsville Road. After serving as a military intelligence officer in the US Army, he was ready to reprioritize his life. Married and with 4 children under the age of 4, he was granted a special request for hardship resignation after losing his older brother Gene in a terrible car accident. And so he packed up his life and moved his family back to Pittsburgh, specifically to Brentwood, the borough where he had grown up all those years before. Desirous to give his children the best sort of upbringing, one where they could ride their bikes to visit their grandparents whenever they liked, it seemed like fate when he heard that the owners of 3406 Brownsville Road, a stately 14-roomed mini mansion with leaded glass windows, big white pillars, and ornate woodwork, were extremely anxious to sell. It had, after all, been his childhood ambition to own that particular house, having passed it on a regular basis, staring across the large yard with fascination as a boy. And so he jumped at the chance, arranging a viewing and having his first offer accepted straight away by the couple who owned it. And yet, right from the very beginning, there is said to have been something unsettling about the building. Writing in his autobiographical book, The Demon of Brownsville Road, Cranmer describes how, when viewing the property for the first time, his eldest son, a then 2-year-old by the name of Bobby Jr., wandered away from his parents. They found him crying, his mouth wide open and his eyes squeezed shut, on the first landing of the staircase. It seemed as though he had got lost in the big house, and yet, when they first heard his tears, Mrs. McHenry, the lady who was selling the house, raced to find him, immediately throwing her arms around him when she did. According to Cranmer, she looked around frantically as she embraced the little boy, almost as if she expected to see something. After asking Bobby if something had scared him, the woman gently released him, then told Cranmer and his wife Lisa that they needed to keep better track of their children. At the time, the Cranmers dismissed the incident, attributing Mrs. McHenry's words to her odd personality and reluctance to leave a home that she and her husband had obviously put so much work into. And yet, after moving into the property later that year, Cranmer couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to Mrs. McHenry's behaviour than her own personal peculiarity. According to Cranmer, walking into the house felt like walking into the inner bowels of a large ocean-going ship. It was engulfing, all-consuming, and everyone who lived there felt it. The children, so Cranmer writes, felt uncomfortable being alone at night in their rooms and would often sneak into their parents' bed by morning. Bobby had an especial dislike of his bed and would often be found fast asleep, curled up inside his closet with the light turned on. He did this so regularly, in fact, that his parents eventually gave up trying to coax him out and instead put a crib mattress in the closet for him to sleep on, a behaviour that he continued for about a year after moving in. And so, in Bob Cranmer's mind, there was undoubtedly a negative energy in the house. Even so, he tried to dismiss it, blaming it on the fact that neither he nor his children were used to living in such large rooms. Eventually, they would all acclimatise. It was, after all, his dream home, and the last thing he wanted was for it to transform into a nightmare. In an attempt to put her son and his young family's minds at rest, Cranmer's mother suggested that they ask a priest to come and bless the house. And so, reluctantly, Cranmer agreed, and invited his mother's favourite priest, an approachable, affable man called Father Victor, to do so. Room by room he blessed the home, the only exception being Bobby's bedroom. Scowling in the doorway, he refused to let the priest enter. It was no matter. The priest would simply bless the outside and continue on his way. There was no use in upsetting a little boy, especially since he was already having problems settling into his bedroom. And so it was that the Cranmer family began a new chapter in their life. A new house, a new job, and even, Cranmer tells in his book, a new car. Everything was fresh and exciting for the family, and yet it didn't feel like it at all. This feeling intensified when, planting flowers in the front yard the spring after moving, Cranmer discovered a small metal box buried about 6 inches down into the soil. Inside there were several religious medals and a set of rosary beads. When he phoned the previous owners to ask if they knew anything about it, he claims he was told, forcefully, to put it back exactly where he had found it. It was soon after this that strange things began to happen inside the house. In his book, Cranmer is clear to state that the first few incidents were more annoying than alarming. The light pole in the cupboard under the stairs, for example, would often be discovered meticulously twisted around one of the small screws which held in the glass shade of the light. It was too high up for his children to reach, and his wife, Lisa, asserted that she hadn't done it. In other areas of the house, specifically the basement, lights are said to have turned on by themselves. Cranmer even claims that a chair, which ought to have been positioned at his workbench, would regularly move, mysteriously and without explanation, so that it was sitting in the center of the room, facing the wood burner. Upstairs, in the middle of the night, outside the doors of their bedrooms, his children would report the sounds of footsteps and knocking. It was inexplicable and certainly strange, but Bob and Lisa knew little of what to do. And so they laughed it off, half jokingly, half not, blaming it on their very own Casper the Friendly Ghost. Then, when their children started to report seeing a misty, black figure stalking the corners, corridors and doorways of the house, the joking stopped. Around this time, Bob Cranmer had begun to pursue a career in politics, being elected to Brentwood Council in 1991. This meant he was often away from the house, working late and away from his family. As might be expected, his relationship with both his wife and his children began to strain. They would get into fights more often, tempers would be lost all too easily and over issues that were really not worth the heartache. And yet his political career, so Cranmer reflects in his book, was only partly to blame. The disputes were simply too much, too frequent, too out of control. Certainly, after moving into Bobby's bedroom, a room which the family referred to as the Blue Room for a time whilst they renovated another part of the house, Lisa is said to have suffered such acute personality changes that she ended up spending 2 weeks in a psychiatric ward. She had, so Cranmer claims, suffered a mental attack, her energy being drained by the evil which resided in the house. An evil which, for some concealed reason, was connected to the Blue Room. Talking about his experiences many years later, Bobby has explained how the Blue Room profoundly frightened him. It had, after all, been his bedroom for 6 years, and it was in there that, so he has alleged, he once saw a Grim Reaper-esque entity that terrified him to such an extreme degree that he felt as though he was going to die. One day, whilst in the 5th grade, and so 10 or 11 years of age, Bobby was off school. Ill, he was home alone, his father at work, his siblings at school, and his mother at the pharmacy getting him medicine. He describes lying in bed when he heard a strange noise, something akin to the sound of bagpipes, getting louder and louder. As it did, the door to his room opened. It was at this point that something very peculiar indeed supposedly entered the room. It was made out of what looked like static or lightning bolts, so Bobby relayed in his father's book. It was in the shape of a child's body, but without a face. Upon entering his bedroom, it is said to have moved to the end of his bed. Thereafter, a second figure appeared in the doorway. This one was darker than the last, much darker in fact. Tall, dressed in a black hooded robe, with one hand extending out from the fabric, it ran past the door. When Bobby, in fear, dragged his blankets over his head, they were supposedly ripped away, revealing another figure again. Floating above him, bright and faceless, it caused him to scream and squeeze his eyes shut until his mother returned home. Of course, it is very easy to attribute this childhood experience to illness. Bedbound and in need of medication, Bobby may have had a fever which could have provoked hallucinations. Although frightening, such sensory experiences while sick are not impossible. And yet, taken alongside everything else that is alleged to have occurred in the Brownsville Road house, it can be said to be a somewhat of a pedantic point to make. After all, as the happenings continued to escalate, the family invited others to come and bear witness. By early 2004, when the activity is said to have become entirely unhinged, with regular sightings, sounds and even smells, including that of burning sulfur, being experienced in the house. This included 2 Passionist priests, Father Ed Moran and Michael Salvagna. In their opinion, the Cranmer family were experiencing demonic infestation. Father Ed was the first of the two men to become involved. Describing himself as not really an expert in deliverance work, he nonetheless promised to do what he could, and subsequently visited the home to celebrate Mass with the family and perform prayers of expulsion. The very next day, picture frames across the house had been disturbed. Then, in the days after, other furniture was supposedly moved. The taps on the bath were opened, causing the tub to overflow. Clocks and watches were stopped. Electrical appliances, including the coffee maker and the toaster, broke. Plugs were pulled from electrical sockets, and both computers in the house were constantly going haywire. The situation was fast escalating out of control, most especially when, so claimed Bobby and his then girlfriend, who was with him in his bedroom at the time, a CD flew across the room, slamming into a wall and exploding into several jagged pieces. It had barely missed the young man's head. 1 inch closer, it might have done him serious injury. For all of this, there was no explanation, except perhaps what the priest had told them, that there was a demon spirit, possessive and aggressive, in the house. Before too long, a second priest became involved. His name was Father Michael Salvagna. Although not an official exorcist, he had over the years acquired a reputation for deliverance work. And so, arriving at the house in February 2004, his arrival signified a shift in the Cranmer case. What follows in Bob Cranmer's book can only be described as acutely terrifying. Confronted head-on, the entity claimed to reside in the house is said to have become bolder, more aggressive, and more intent on achieving its purpose of utterly disrupting and destroying the Cranmer family. Not merely did the relationships between different members of the family continue to decline, with Bob openly admitting that he and Lisa came close to divorce on several occasions, they also found themselves at war with their own selves. In an echo of Lisa's mental breakdown years before, both Bobby and another of the couple's sons, Charlie, attempted to take their own lives, earning them stays in Western Psychiatric Hospital. Everyone who slept in the home suffered terrible nightmares, with them on occasion waking to discover inexplicable, long, red, deep scratches and even bite marks on their bodies. Another ominous development was the discovery of puddles of blood-like fluid on the floors and walls of the house. Sometimes red and other times a rusty orange colour, it was also found on the metal threads of burnt-out light bulbs and, remarkably, 9 feet up the wall on the staircase leading to the upper level of the house. There was no way that anyone would have been able to deposit the sinister liquid there without a ladder. If it had been thrown, then how was it that the ceiling remained unsoiled? Besides, Cranmer could not understand what motive there would have been for someone in the household to have done it. And so, unexplained, the liquid continued to appear for weeks and smelt, according to Lisa, like amniotic fluid. Wet and dripping, it, in Bob Cranmer's own words, looked as if the walls were bleeding. As the activity in the house intensified, Father Michael continued to visit and perform Mass, praying, blessing, and invoking the name and power of God and Jesus in order to drive the infestation from the home. As little as it seemed to be working, the family were told to expect it to get worse before it got better. The entity's reaction to their assaults was merely an increased effort on its part to make them stop, and thus intimidate them into capitulation. And so it was that yet another priest got involved. Described as the right-hand man of the bishop, Father Ron Lengwin was the spokesman for the diocese and had been asked to help the family after one of Cranmer's political friends, who knew of his situation, called the bishop on his behalf. For reasons which Cranmer did not understand at the time, Father Ron never once visited the family home on Brownsville Road, and instead aided and instructed the family via telephone. At this point, the story becomes not merely more complicated, but more fantastical, but then also perhaps not. For if one is to believe in darkness, then one must equally believe in the light which makes it so, for certainly one cannot exist without the other. In this way, it is said by both Bob Cranmer and Father Ron, who has spoken publicly about the case in the years since, that a Christian mystic began to advise on the case. Her name was Connie Valenti. A woman by then in her 70s, she had, after aiding the police with a serious investigation, experienced backlash in the past, and as such had no desire for publicity. And so, a longtime friend of Father Ron, her involvement was kept secret from the Cranmer family until many years later. The insights that she was able to give allegedly came through extraordinary visions, something which, in a 2019 interview with the Catholic news website Spirit Daily, Father Ron described as spiritual knowledge given to her by God so as to help people. She was able, so we are told, to envision the interior of the Brownsville Road house without ever having been there, and thus view the spiritual presences inside. With such knowledge, she was able to offer advice to the family, which was given to them via the medium of Father Ron. In parapsychology, such an ability is referred to as remote viewing or clairvoyance. From a religious perspective, it is mysticism. Amongst many things, Valenti via Father Ron told the Cranmers to cover a particular mirror in the house with a cloth. She also said that Bob should go through the house, room by room, throwing a small pinch of salt in every corner, including the entrances. As he did this, he was to repeat, "You are to leave this house, leave my family alone, and go back to where you came from." Other prayers were also recommended, all the while Father Michael continued to perform Mass for the family. Still, the activity worsened, and so by the summer of 2004, it was startlingly usual for Bob Cranmer to wake in the mornings covered in scratches. Long red marks which ran like 3 claws from his neck down to his chest. Others in the house experienced this also, including his wife Lisa, who is said to have been physically pushed as well as marked. His son Bobby was even once so badly attacked that he had to be taken to the doctor. He had puncture wounds on his stomach. The medical professionals said that it looked as if a dog had bitten him. The family knew better. As the mystic Connie Valenti continued to advise the family, with Father Ron phoning Cranmer on a near-daily basis, some things, we are told, became clear to her. The evil in the house, she alleged, was primarily focused upon hurting children and mothers. The reason for this was, in part, because of a man who had been responsible for a tremendous amount of blood and more deaths than can be counted. According to local legend, a doctor who had once resided at another house on Brownsville Road, a house which publicly had a reputation for being haunted, had performed many illegal abortions in the 1920s and 30s. According to Valenti, whilst this may have been true, she felt a connection between that same doctor and the Cranmer residence. He had done evil things there, Father Ron related to Cranmer during one of their phone calls. Rough and rude and often drunk, the doctor was supposedly careless and made many mistakes in his work, taking no care for sanitary conditions and as such causing pain, anguish and even the deaths of some of his patients. As for the remains of the terminations, these he had burnt in the furnace in the basement of the Cranmer's house. For, according to Valenti's visions, the doctor had rented space in the house away from his own home to set up a covert clinic so as to be able to perform his illegal procedures. The family who owned the property at the time was suffering financial troubles and so had consented, providing the doctor with, as Connie alleged, the bedroom at the top of the steps next to the bathroom, the room which the Cranmer family knew as the Blue Room. In particular, Valenti is said to have seen the body of a woman in a white dress who died at the bottom of the staircase. She wasn't married, but had been sent there by a friend, an older man, a politician. She was put in a car and taken to the hospital. She also claimed to have seen another woman screaming in pain, besides a knocked-over pan filled with blood. Such would explain the blood on the walls, the smell of birthing fluid, and even the hooded, Grim Reaper-like robed figure sighted so many times in the house. It was a house of death, and this had triggered the demonic infestation. On top of this, it was also alleged not merely by Valenti but by many in the local area that a mother and her 3 young children had been dispatched on the grounds of the property by marauding Native Americans towards the end of the 18th century. This act of barbarity was supposedly done to discourage continued pioneer settlement in the area. The woman's husband, so the story goes, had been away fighting during the Northwest Indian War at the time. When he returned and discovered the shattered remains of his family, he had buried them there, planting an oak tree over their grave. Combined with the later, blood-soaked medical procedures said to have taken place in the house, this manifested a dark entity, one which revelled in the suffering of innocence and would seek, for as long as the land was occupied, to cause yet more pain and torment. It has also been suggested that all of this was exacerbated by a curse placed upon the house when it was built. One of the labourers working on the property is said to have coveted the young wife of the owner. When she did not respond to his advances, he cursed her, her husband, and indeed the very house which would shelter their marriage. And so, according to Bob Cranmer and indeed many others involved in the case, there were several reasons why the house was as it was. Such a sentiment was allegedly shared by the property's previous owners, most memorably in the odd behaviours of the McHenrys, the couple from whom the Cranmers had purchased the property. It is said that when Bob phoned in an attempt to arrange to meet up so as to talk explicitly about the activity in the house, Mr. McHenry became nervous and hung up. Another who had previously resided in the house, the by then elderly daughter of the man who took possession of the property in 1941, is said to have been more forthcoming. Cranmer describes a meeting with her during which she confirmed that she had experienced something of a spiritual nature in the house. Reportedly, during a housewarming party, a terrible racket had been heard upstairs. Slamming doors, pounding on the walls, and furniture moving about. No one was supposed to be up there, and despite the entire party searching the entire house, no intruder could be found. It was suggested that such inexplicable happenings soon became a regular occurrence for the lady and her family. That the house was a hotbed of paranormal activity was also confirmed by researchers from the Penn State Paranormal Research Society. Comprising students from Pennsylvania State University, the group was invited to Brownsville Road by the Cranmers in early 2005. Acting on the advice of Father Ron, it was hoped that they could, a third party with no ties to the diocese, provide the verification required so as to petition the church to send a trained exorcist to the property. It was, after all, by that point, becoming increasingly obvious that the prayers and advice of Father Ron and Connie Valenti, in combination with the deliverance prayers of Father Michael, were not enough to shake the demonic entity from the house. And so, in late January, the paranormal group arrived. In total, they visited the house on Brownsville Road twice. Each time, they are said to have experienced profound paranormal activity, with one member, Adam Bly, described as the group's instructor and advisor, supposedly being scratched on the forehead. Blood, so Bob Cranmer informs us in his book, ran down Bly's face, with others in the group witnessing it as it happened. They also detected temperature anomalies and experienced equipment malfunctions. Perhaps the most intriguing and indeed chilling discovery that the paranormal group made whilst at the Cranmer's house, however, was that of a secret space, a hidden spot in the centre of the house that only became accessible after Cranmer cut through the wall inside the cupboard under the stairs. On the other side, he and the researchers found a small L-shaped area. Filled with black coal dust, it is said to have housed various objects. A palm-sized amber stone, the complete skeleton of a small bird, 3 playing cards, some of his son's old Lego toys, and a crumpled piece of paper. When laid flat, the paper revealed 2 hand-drawn sketches, one on the front and one on the back. The front was a simple, idyllic image that seemed to be the view from the back garden of the house at sunset. The reverse, however, was anything but idyllic. a disturbing image of a cigar-smoking man being laughed at by another with a pig's head and a coiled snake. How or why these objects had ended up in the sealed-off void was entirely unknown. According to Adam Bly, who spoke about the happenings in a 2014 interview with Fox 8 News, the objects were indicative of some very strange, possibly dark stuff. Eventually, the family were able to get the help that they needed. The chief exorcist of the Archdiocese of New York, Father James Labar, arrived at the house in September 2005. Aided by a young priest named Father Ben, as well as Father Michael and Father Ed Moran, he led a prayer ritual designed to defeat the demon, bind it, and cast it out from the house. When the exorcist was finished, he warned the family to expect echo events to occur on and off over the following few months. Ultimately, however, he was happy with how the evening had progressed. As for Bob Cranmer, he was, if anything, underwhelmed. He had anticipated something profound, thunder, lightning, levitation, something. Instead there was nothing, not even the demonic stench which had, over the years, become so synonymous with the unnatural happenings. As the exorcist had stated, there was, according to Cranmer, further activity at the property. It did, however, dwindle until Friday the 24th of February 2006, when a final mass was held, led by the ever-faithful Father Michael in the basement of the house. A dim, black, hazy outline of a figure was supposedly seen by several who attended. Intermittent tapping was also allegedly heard throughout the ceremony. Cranmer recalls how he followed the barely visible, smoky figure into the coal room, closely followed by the priest. Together they prayed, with Father Michael holding out his St. Benedict's crucifix as Cranmer repeatedly, loudly said, "This is the end. You will leave, and leave now. This is over." And so it was. The entity, the dark force which had stalked the Cranmer family for years, haunting their home and pushing them to the very brink of sanity, dispersed, with, according to Cranmer's testimony, the black misty figure melting right into the floor in front of him. After 17 years, it was over. As sensational and perhaps unbelievable as these alleged events are, it is difficult to stress just how well documented this story is. Hundreds of pages of notes, meticulously kept across the years by Bob Cranmer, led to the writing of the authoritative book The Demon of Brownsville Road. Not merely that, many of the case's key participants, from Cranmer himself to Father Ron Lenguin to Adam Bly, have spoken publicly about what happened. And this is by no means a hollow boast. Not merely are these figures clear and sober in their expression of their experiences, but also extremely well regarded as individuals. Ordained in 1966, Father Ron Lenguin occupies a senior position within the Diocese of Pittsburgh, having acted as chief spokesman as well as hosting the widely enjoyed local Catholic radio program Amplify since 1975. In terms of Adam Bly, he, after his involvement in the Brownsville case, went on to become a church-decreed expert on religious demonology and exorcism, leading him to assist at many dozens of solemn exorcisms, and even as an auxiliary member of the International Association of Exorcists based in Rome to help educate and train priests regarding the rite. As for Bob Cranmer himself, as well as having worked in Army intelligence and serving as a company commander with the 101st Airborne Division, he also served as County Commissioner of Allegheny County from 1996 to 2000, a role which on multiple occasions put him into conflict with what he has claimed was the acutely corrupt local police department. A public figure with what seems to be a firebrand desire to do good and serve his community, many would defend Bob Cranmer as the very last person to seek to profit from a false story. And so, if you believe that such things are possible, diabolical hauntings, demonic infestations, exorcisms, 3406 Brownsville Road comes across as the place where this happened. Certainly, the Catholic Church seems to agree, with the Diocese of Pittsburgh possibly in response to the events that happened in Brentwood, now employing its own Rome-trained exorcist. And yet, despite the case's strong foundation of credibility, there have been criticisms, chiefly that, if not entirely fraudulent, many of the events reported by Bob Cranmer found their origin in natural causes and not supernatural ones. Indeed, it is clear from reading his book that his political career not merely meant a lot to him, but took up a large part of his life. Thus, it can be argued that, instead of owning up to the damage that his political career inflicted on his family, the absenteeism, the arguments, the strained relationships, the depression and mental breakdowns, Cranmer scapegoated the paranormal as a means to explain away the negative energy he felt in his home. After all, when introducing the Brownsville Road house, he wrote that its grandeur fitted his aspirations like a glove, with its stately appearance, 14 rooms and 6 fireplaces, perfectly matching his personality and ambitions at the time, with him always having viewed himself as a general or respected statesman. Not merely this, in moments of self-reflection, Cranmer explains how his own ego and inability to admit defeat meant he placed his loved ones in the line of fire by remaining in the house, in spite of all that was happening there. And yet, even if there is some truth in this argument, that does not explain the inescapably paranormal happenings said to have occurred in the house. The manifestations of black-robed figures, the blood-like substance dripping from the walls. Certainly, Cranmer went to great effort to ensure that these phenomena were well documented by not merely inviting several different sorts of people into his home to witness them, but also by keeping and cataloguing artifacts, including strips of the stained wallpaper, various bent and broken crosses and crucifixes said to have been attacked by the entity, and strange photographs of spectral manifestations. He was even able to send a sample of the peculiar liquid to a laboratory. Not blood, it contained mildew, spores, and disturbingly, skin cells. Precisely what it was, or how it got onto the walls, was never determined. Then there are the claims which address why the activity manifested in the house at all. The Native American killings, the diabolical doctor, the curse. In terms of the former, Cranmer was extraordinarily able to confirm the grave site under the oak tree by hiring a company to use ground-penetrating radar. Their report concluded that their findings of a man-made disturbance were consistent with an excavated gravesite. In addition to this, Cranmer, through his own archival research, was also able to find a letter dating to the 31st of March 1792, which references the wife of a Deliverance Brown having been killed along with her 3 children. Written by Isaac Craig, the commander of the nearby Fort Pitt, to the Secretary of War during the Northwest Indian War, Henry Knox, it is suggested that this tragedy is the one which engendered the oak tree gravesite. As for the 1920s doctor, he too has been confirmed as a real historical figure. Records show that a Dr. James Merton Mahan did live on Brownsville Road at number 3233, with the wealthy paediatrician having a questionable local reputation. Whilst it is, of course, impossible to prove whether or not he rented rooms at the other Brownsville Road house, let alone if he performed illegal medical procedures, it has been said by, astonishingly, one of his own granddaughters that he had an evil, child-hating demeanour, with her early memories including having shoes thrown at her by him when she was just a toddler. Today, 3406 Brownsville Road goes by a different name, Grand Oaks Manor. It was changed by Cranmer to honour the old oak tree which marks the grave of the mother and her 3 children. The house is also known as the Brownsville Road House Bed and Breakfast, with Cranmer having converted it into such in November 2019, after his marriage of 37 years fell apart in the aftermath of the unexpected death of his and Lisa's son, David. And contrary to what you might think, the B&B is not marketed as a dark tourism location. There is no spooky decor, neither are there candlelit ghost stories or jump scares. Instead, it is presented as a charming and delightfully decorated historic manor, serving daily breakfast and romantic afternoon teas. Hardly a demon house. Indeed, in a 2019 interview with a local news outlet in which he announced the opening of the new B&B, Cranmer addressed the issue of the building's demonic reputation by saying, "Certainly, there will be people who come to visit the house because of the book, and you are welcome to do that, but I'm not looking for ghost hunter teams. We don't want mediums here to do seances, nothing like that, because we worked really hard to clean that stuff out of this house." As far as he is concerned, that terrible chapter in his life is over. And so, whatever you might think of it, the demon of Brownsville Road was very real to Bob Cranmer and his family. It was traumatic, chaotic, painful, and very almost destroyed his family. As he closes in his book, pure evil does exist. It can be openly and aggressively malevolent, but above all, it proves the existence of the divine. For without darkness, there cannot be light. Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more of the paranormal. Equally, if you are interested in finding out more about this case, I have included links to my sources, including Bob Cranmer's highly readable book in the description box, which is something that I do for every video that I post. And so, if you cannot wait until my next upload, why not watch the one suggested on screen now? Until next time,